Hello, everyone. This is Professor Bisoni, and this is Ancient History. In this course, we're going to examine the history of ancient civilizations from the beginning until the fall of the Roman Empire. Over the course of these 5 weeks, we are going to examine the political institutions, the technology, the social organization, the economic trends, and of course, the cultural output of these great civilizations, which are part of who we are today. The first question that we have to ask is, how do historians know what happened in the past? And what I want to talk about today is four different forms of sources that we use to reconstruct the past. The first one is archaeology. Archaeology is the study of ancient artifacts. When we think of archaeology, we have these images, very romantic images of people like Indiana Jones going into this temple with beautiful treasures. Or we have this image of the tomb of Tutankhamun, who lived in Egypt, and his tomb was found intact in 1922 and is perhaps the most fabulous archaeological finding. But most archaeology is more humble than that. Archaeologists spend their years putting together pieces of pottery, tools, finding out the layouts of the dwellings of simple peasants. By studying the artifacts, the houses, the tools, the weapons, the burial customs, the fabrics that these civilizations produce, we can reconstruct an image of who they are. So, archaeological sources are essential to our knowledge of early history. The next one is written sources. Writing was invented by the Sumerians around the year 3500 BC, and writing was invented several times by different civilizations. The initial impetus, the initial purpose of writing was to record harvests, to have records of how much grain was stored in the official granaries. It was very practical. But once you have the ability to write, once you have the ability to um, reproduce the sounds of your voice, you also want to record your accomplishments. And kings used writing to record what they thought was their accomplishments. People started to write poetry. They wrote stories. Written sources provide us with the voice of the people who lived at that time. That doesn't mean that we have to believe everything that we read in the ancient sources. Many of these ancient sources were written for political purpose, for propaganda purposes. The person who wrote the history of a king wrote that history with a specific audience in mind, with a specific purpose in mind. So we have to be very conscious of how we analyze these ancient written sources. Nonetheless, it is a treasure. It is literally traveling back in time, and living through the words of the people who wrote those sources. Another important source is linguistics. And linguistics is the science of studying the development and spread of language. Linguistics developed mainly in the 19th century, and the big question that linguists were asking themselves at that time was there one language and all languages come from that, or was language invented at different times? And that question now has more or less an answer, and the answer is that language probably developed in different places at different times. But what linguists discover is that languages are organisms, and like an organism, it is born, it reproduces. Some of these organisms die, others actually develop through vast territories. And if we look at the development of ancient languages all the way uh, down to our own period, we can actually trace the movements of peoples. Language can only develop through contact among different groups. So, as we see the development of different families of languages, we can trace the course that certain groups of people took over periods of hundreds or thousands of years. The last source that we use is genetics. And genetics is something that we have been using only for the past 30 years or so. Genetics is the study of the human genome. When someone has a child, he and she passes the genetic information to the next generation. And every human cell contains a history of that lineage. Geneticists have been able to uh, basically develop the whole human genome and trace it back to the very early origins of humanity. And by looking at genetics, we can also trace the movements of ancient societies. When we combine archaeology, written sources, linguistics, and genetics, a clearer picture of the past emerges. Now, in this image, we have a pictorial describing how languages are related to each other. So this is particularly about one family of languages, is the Indo-European language and the Uralic language. So when you look at this, you can see that the Indo-European language is this huge family of languages that starts from a common origin and then spreads through the branches into many, many other languages. And as you can see, the most widely spoken would be English and Spanish and Hindi, but there are some minor languages. Some of them, by the way, have become extinct. And right here to the left, to the right, I'm sorry, you can see a smaller tree, and that's the Uralic languages. And these are languages that are not at all related to the Indo-European languages. When the linguists were putting these family trees of languages together, they provided us with a sense of what the early movements of prehistoric peoples in Eurasia were. And some people were very skeptical about that. However, with the development of genetic information, we now have a very good account of how those movements of people took place. And what we discover is that what the linguists had come up with, the conclusions to which the linguists had arrived in the past, match very closely with what geneticists have told us about the human origins. Humanity originated in Africa, probably about 200,000 years ago. So we are a very new species. We come from older species of hominids, and we are related to other species like Neanderthals and other groups that became extinct thousands of years ago. So we were latecomers, and we originated in southeastern Africa, perhaps around what today would be Botswana, maybe into the areas of what today would be Tanzania and Kenya. There's still some debate about that, but indications are that it was most probably in the southern part of Africa. So, for about 150,000 years, humans lived in very small groups in the southern part of Africa. But about 50 or 60,000 years ago, something happened. Climatic changes forced these early groups of humans to move. And some moved to other parts of Africa, others moved north, and eventually they crossed into Asia. At this point, the human genome begins to diversify. And over the next few thousand years, what we see is human advancing from what today would be the Arabian Peninsula into what today is India, into Southeast Asia, and probably 40,000 years ago, humans arrived in Australia. Now, at that time, because of the levels of ice, the oceans were actually lower. So, Australia, while it was not completely connected to the Asian continent, was closer in terms of navigation. So, those early humans probably took rafts or boats and they crossed from South Asia into Australia. Of course, when the sea levels rose again, these populations became isolated and they did not come into contact with other humans until around the year 1600 when the Europeans rediscovered Australia. Other branches of humanity developed into Central Asia, and in Central Asia they stayed for several thousands of years. And from there, groups emigrated into northern India, into what today is China, and eventually they became the ancestors of modern Europeans. And lastly, probably about around 14,000 or 12,000 years ago, we have the last group, a group that during the hottest part of the Ice Age crossed from Siberia into what today is Alaska. At that time, because of the Ice Age, the sea levels had uh, lowered, and this enabled these migrants, these early humans, to cross by foot into what today is Alaska. They found an ice-free passage from Alaska into what today is the United States, and within a few thousand years, there were humans in North America, in Central America, in the jungles of South America, in the mountains of Peru, on the islands of the Caribbean. It is amazing how fast humans were able to reproduce, to multiply, and eventually to populate that new continent. That new continent, of course, was cut off from contact with the other continents until Columbus arrived in 1492. So, genetics provides a very exact view of how those movements took place. Actually, we even know with certain degree of certainty when those movements took place. And one of the most amazing things about us today is that we are very, very closely related. Just to give you a sense of how close we are, when humans crossed from Siberia into Alaska, it is believed that there were probably only about 20 people in that group, mostly women. And out of that small group of 20 people, all the Native Americans descend. The Sioux, the Navajos, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Toltecs, the Incas, the Carib, every single group. And their diversity is amazing. When Columbus arrived in 1492, there were 100 million people on the American continent. Some still lived like hunter gatherers, others, like the Mayas or the Incas or the Aztecs, had developed amazing civilizations. That is the richness of humans and human variety. And of course, the same thing happened in the other continents. When we speak of early humans, uh, we have to look at forms of economic production. And the earliest organization that existed among humans in terms of producing food and goods was hunting gathering. Hunting gathering was the hunting of animals and the collection of anything that was edible. Hunter gatherers lived in small groups, some of them as few as 20, large ones probably 75 to 100. They had a very basic social organization, and they moved from place to place looking for food. Hunting sometimes refers to hunting big game like antelopes, for example. But a lot of the time, hunting is more like trapping rodents, trapping animals that are smaller in size. In addition to hunting, they are fishing, they are collecting clams or mussels, they collect berries and nuts and seeds and roots and insects. Insects were a big part of the diet of early humans. One of the problems with hunting gathering is that you are completely dependent on your environment and you cannot have a permanent dwelling because your resources disappear, so you have to be on the move. And that means that hunting gathering societies were never too big. It is during this period that the first domestications take place. Some 30,000 years ago, perhaps, humans domesticated dogs. Actually, they took wolves and they made them into dogs. Wolves are social animals, they're hunters, and it doesn't take much to imagine how early human groups would take a wolf pup and then raise that pup into a member of the family, so to speak. And of course, as hunters, they use the skills of this wolf. And through selective breeding, eventually they develop the species of dogs that we know from antiquity and from today. And at the same time, humans develop a very, very, very strong friendship with these little and sometimes not so little furry things. Our relationship with dogs is something that is very, very ancient. As time went by, other animals were domesticated. And the first one after dogs was the sheep, and soon after that, the goat. This happened in the Middle East, and this is extremely important because it's going to change the way that humans live. From hunting gathering, they moved to a new way of life called pastoralism. Pastoralism is the raising of animals so that you can benefit from them in many ways. So, if you raise sheep, you use their wool, you can kill them to eat their meat, but there's something else that happened here. You can also use them to drink their milk. So the relationship with sheep and humans is also very, very old. Of course, if you have herds of animals, there are two things that you depend on: grass and water. So you move according to the needs of your herds. So the first herds were sheep, goats. Eventually, humans are going to domesticate other animals, cattle, geese, chicken, pigs, and one of the last animals to be domesticated is going to be the horse. So here what we have is what we call a nomadic way of life. A nomad is someone who moves from place to place. So if you're a hunter gatherer, you are a nomad. You have to be a nomad because it's very difficult to find a place where you can settle permanently and find all the resources that you need. If you are a pastoralist, obviously you are also a nomad. Your herds need grass and they need water, so you have to be constantly on the move. The opposite of a nomadic life is a sedentary life. That is when you settle permanently in one place. And that's very difficult if you are a hunter, gatherer, or you are a shepherd, a pastoralist. However, there are examples of sedentary life among pastoralists in the Middle East, in the area of what today is Iraq. And what happened is that in this area, during this period of time, around 10,000, 9,000 BC, uh, this area was not yet desertic. It was more like a savanna like environment. There was a lot of water, and that means that if you're a hunter gatherer, you can live in this place almost permanently because there's enough game, there's enough fish, there's enough water, there are enough resources so that you don't have to move. If you're a pastoralist, also, you can be both a nomad and someone who follows a sedentary life. What does that mean? It means that you have a permanent home, but a few months a year you move for the benefit of your herds of sheep or goats. However, there is this attachment to the land that is beginning to take place. The way in which we lived in those early days had a profound transformation on us in terms of our social organization, in terms of our culture, in terms of our language, of course, but there are also physical changes. And here's one example. These two maps provide us with a glimpse of something called lactase persistence. I am sure that you have heard about lactose intolerant. Lactose is the sugar in milk. And when we are babies, we are mammals, right? For the first 4 years, we can drink milk. And actually, that's all we eat mostly. And we can live on that for a couple of years. What happens is that as we grow up, we become intolerant to lactose. And that's why some people, when they eat too much, drink too much milk, or they eat dairy products, they have digestive problems. However, something happened in the Middle East thousands of years ago. Humans discovered that they could milk goats and sheep, and you could make cheese with that, right? And that was a new source of nutrition. So they started to use this milk, even as adults. And what happened is that in these cultures, where milk became part of their diet, there was a genetic transformation. Uh, some humans today have a gene that enables them to tolerate lactose. So even though you're an adult, you can eat cheese, cream, milk, and you're fine. There are people, however, who drink a glass of milk or who eat cheese who will have very serious digestive problems. And that is because their culture, their ancestors, never developed a taste for milk. If you look at some of the data today, for example, people from East Asian origin and from African origin, depending the area where they come from, usually are lactose intolerant. And that is why, because in their cultures, they never develop a taste for milk or dairy products. If you go to a Chinese supermarket, have you ever seen Chinese cheese? No, because it's not part of the culture to eat dairy. Same thing in East Africa, where even though they have herds of cows, usually what they do is that they bleed the cow rather than milk it. And sometimes they do mix the blood with the milk. But you have less of a milk culture. There's definitely not a cheese culture. So this is just an example of how the way of life, diet, culture can have profound transformations upon who we are, even physically. Real sedentary life, that is, when you don't move from place to place, only takes place with the Neolithic Revolution. What is the Neolithic Revolution? It is basically the beginning of agriculture and the settlement of humans in permanent dwellings, in permanent homelands. It is hard to give an accurate date for this, but we could say that around the year 10,000 BC, agriculture begins. And agriculture, as you can see in this image, begins with the cultivation of tall grasses. Humans realize that grasses have seeds and that those seeds can be stored for a long time. And they also discovered that if you take one of these seeds, you put it in the ground, and after a while, there's going to be a sprout, and that seed becomes a new plant. So the logic is if we collect enough of these seeds, we don't eat them all, we eat probably half, and then we keep the other half. Next year, we can plant them and have food. This is a revolutionary thought. And of course, it's easier said than done. Uh, we are sure that it took many uh, trials and a lot of errors for these early farmers to become successful. But it is believed that within probably about 100 years of experimentation, the farmers of the Middle East developed some basic cereals: wheat, oats, rye, and barley. These grains became the foundation of a new way of life. And this takes place here. The Neolithic Revolution takes place in a geographic area called the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent, as you can see on this map, is the green area. It's called fertile because this is where agriculture begins, and crescent because it has the shape of a crescent moon. Today, it would cover areas of Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Iraq. It is hill country, it's not flatland. It is not lush, but there's enough water for the grain to develop. If you look at this map right here, you have a better sense of the location. By the year 8000 BC, there are many agricultural communities. These communities have the ability to produce enough food to sustain larger populations. In this image, from around 10,000 BC, we see a settlement of what we would call the Natufian culture. The term Natufian culture refers to not a group of people, but a set of technological skills that the people of the area practiced at the time. So we don't know what these Natufians looked like. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't even know if they were the same people. What we do know is that all of these people who lived in the same area, we're talking about the Fertile Crescent, around the year 10,000 BC, had the same technologies. They knew how to plant cereals, they knew how to harvest them, they knew how to build these very primitive types of houses. They developed certain tools, certain weapons, and that's why we call them the Natufian culture. The dwellings seem very humble, but look at the next image. This is an archaeological site in modern day Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. It is believed that it was built around 9000 BC. In this image, the artist has imagined how this place was built. Uh, it is gigantic in its proportions. What is interesting is that the same people of the Natufian culture that we saw before, living in these very primitive dwellings, literally holes in the ground with a couple of sticks and some makeshift roof. These people were also able to build these huge temples. The amazing thing about this particular temple is that it was buried on purpose. It was built, it was probably used for some sort of worship, and then it was buried. Who built this? Well, it is believed that there were many agricultural communities in the area, and these communities came together and they decided to build this to honor their gods. And you have to understand how important religion was for these early people. Their lives depended on rain, on fertility, on the ability of their wives to have healthy children and these children to survive their early years. Their lives were very fragile. And for them to offer homage to the gods by building this great temple was necessary. So, even this early on in history, you can see how people who live very humble lives are willing to put a lot of collective effort into building something that is an homage to a power that gives them the ability to survive. As time goes by, these agricultural communities evolve. One of the first ones that starts to resemble a city is called Çatalhöyük. And of course, that's the modern name. And this one is located in what today is Turkey, in the Fertile Crescent. And it thrived around the year 7500 BC. Probably about 6,000 people live in this location. Right here, you see parts of the excavations, protected, of course, from the weather. Through these excavations, archaeologists have been able to reconceptualize what this city, or this settlement, I should say, looked like. According to one artist's conception, this is what Çatalhöyük looked like at the height of its power, if you want to use that word. About 6,000 people live here. And as you can see, all the structures are huddled together. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Reason number one, by building these structures very close together, one supports the other. We have to remember that this area is prone to earthquakes. So if you have a freestanding structure and there is an earthquake, this structure is going to crumble. But if you put them if you conglomerate them like this, the structures have more stability. The other reason for building these settlements like this is because they offer protection. Once you become a sedentary uh, dweller, that's someone who doesn't move around, you start to build things, you start to accumulate things, you start to produce luxury items. And of course, you will attract others and you will have to defend yourself. So it is believed that part of the design of this city or this settlement is linked to the need to defend themselves from attackers. And there's something else that you may notice in this image. The entrance to the houses is through the roof. In this image right here, you can see there's a ladder, and this ladder is what provides the access to the dwelling. And inside the dwelling, you have a little oven. Those ovens are still used in some parts of the Middle East today, where the bread is cooked, where everything else is produced for the consumption of the family. This image also provides another glimpse of how you enter one of these houses through the roof. And you can imagine that the people who live here live in very, very crowded conditions. We have to understand something else. Once we started to live in permanent dwellings, and at the same time, we're domesticating animals, we're living in close proximity to the animals. And very often, when you live in close proximity to the animals, viruses that live in animals jump into humans. And that's how some of the diseases that we humans suffer develop through that close contact. And of course, uh, given the pandemic of the coronavirus that very likely came from bats and pangolins and then to humans, we can understand how this close proximity with animals results in viruses that are exclusive to animals jumping into humans. And right here, we have an image of what we believe is a goddess from Çatalhöyük. This is a fertility figure. There are many figures like this in archaeological sites from this period. Fertility is the most important thing for these people. These people depend on the fertility of the land to produce food. If the land is not fertile, you die, you starve. Fertility is also important in terms of a woman. A woman's role is to produce as many children as possible. In pre industrial times, it is believed that on average a woman would give birth 8 times, but half of those children would die in infancy. So, fertility is extremely important for these early humans, so they worship images that symbolize fertility. These goddesses of fertility usually have elements that are associated with that. Uh, these figures portray big women with big breasts, with ample hips. All of these are concepts of fertility. And the idea is that by making offerings to these figures, your wife will be fertile, your land will be fertile. There's something a little disturbing about this also. We know that all early human societies practice some form of human sacrifice. There is evidence of human sacrifice practice at Çatalhöyük. There's evidence of human sacrifice practice in early Chinese agricultural settlements. There's evidence of human sacrifice practice in societies in Central America and South America and North America in pre-Columbian times. Some societies went beyond that, and in some cases, the human sacrifice just transformed into something more symbolic, the sacrifice of animals, the offering of things of value. But all of this goes to the notion that fertility is something that is essential to early human societies. In this image, we see the ruins of Jericho. Jericho is the oldest city in the world that still exists and still has inhabitants. It's located in Palestine. Jericho is contemporary with Çatalhöyük. Probably about 8,000 people live there. The city was destroyed and rebuilt several times. So when archaeologists dug through Jericho, they found many layers of different cities at different points in time. In this image, you see how Jericho looks on ground level. And Jericho, like Çatalhöyük, was a society dependent on agriculture. But in Jericho, what we see is the beginning of more complex forms of construction. Everything that I have described until this point has taken place in the Fertile Crescent. But there's this huge area located in the middle of the Fertile Crescent called Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers. This is the area located between the systems of the rivers Euphrates and Tigris, modern day Iraq. And very often you hear, well, Mesopotamia is the beginning of agriculture, the beginning of civilization. Well, not quite, because technically Mesopotamia is the land in the middle around which the Fertile Crescent is located. And the reason agriculture did not develop there first is because the rivers overflow every year. When it snows in the mountains and then rains during the spring, the currents are going to inundate the whole plain, and it makes life very difficult. There were many humans living there, but they had adapted to the circumstances. There were people living in swamps, in floating islands. There were pastoralists who lived there semi permanently because there was a lot of game and a lot of grass and water for their herds. But agriculture is not possible until the people who live there are able to harness the power of the waters. And that happens during the time of the Ubaid culture. Around 6500 BC, we have uh, a lot of settlements that we can begin to call cities. And these cities, at first 10, 15, 20,000, grow into cities of 40 and 50,000 people. And what enables them to build such large populations and such sophisticated cities is their ability to build dams, canals, to redirect the course of the rivers. All of these achievements of engineering is what allows them to create fields that can be dry when planting is needed and can be irrigated when you need the water for the plants to grow. The people of the Ubaid culture transformed completely the geography of the area. And it is right here in Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, the land between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, that the first civilizations emerge. And that first civilization is going to be the Sumerians. And we will talk about them on our next lesson.